Thank you. You've all heard for the last couple of days about how we need to rethink medicine and disease, how we need to rethink our conception of disease. And from Leroy Hood, you heard about these biological networks that are really driving so much of what we see as disease. And this is an idea that is really very difficult for us to understand in medicine because the paradigm shift is so great. It's bigger than Columbus saying the Earth is round, not flat. It's bigger than Galileo saying the Earth is not the center of the universe, or Darwin saying species don't arise in their fixed form, that they evolve through natural selection. Even 150 years later, Mike Pence still is arguing about the theory of evolution. Now, here's the challenge. The diseases as we conceive them today don't really exist. The names and descriptions we have for what disease is don't reflect the underlying biology anymore. Rather, we need to be thinking about functional dynamic networks, biological networks, systems biology, systems medicine. This is the things Leroy Hood talked about. Now, this is a quote from a Lancet article that said, so what is disease? In old times, people used to think that disease was some actual entity or thing which had gotten into the body in some way and was lying there hidden in secret and was to be cast out. This idea, which we now know to be true only in a few specific instances, was at one time a general idea. The conclusion is that all disease is disordered function. Here then I say is the highest justification for treatment, all treatment being based on the principle of restoring disordered functions to order. This is what I've termed functional medicine. Now this was from an article in the Lancet in 1871. Now this is actually finally what we're figuring out based on systems biology. So Leroy Hood talked about scientific wellness. That's what scientific wellness is. It's understanding the continuum of disease from very early disordered function and the patterns and the networks that are becoming disordered, and how do we work with those to reverse those early forms of dysfunction? And how do we then prevent disease? Or how do we even take those disordered functions more toward the end of disease and actually reverse them? Certain things are now emerging that force us to challenge our thinking about disease. Our current theory and description don't make any sense. You heard this morning that the microbiome plays a role in brain function, in depression, in autoimmune disease, in cancer, in heart disease, in dementia, in autism. How does that make sense given our current framework? When you go to the rheumatologist, they don't ask you about your poop. When you go to the cardiologist, they're not asking you about your bowel movements. Why? Because they don't understand these connections that are happening underneath the surface. Same thing with inflammation, another example of how this pattern of dysfunction that exists in the body drives inflammation. Maybe we shouldn't be having specialties by organs. We should be having specialties by causes and mechanisms, right? We divided the body into organ systems, but really we should be thinking about how to look at the organism, not just organs. Medicine by cause, not just by symptoms and geography. Where is it in the body and what is the symptom? Craig Venter decoded the human genome, but in a way, it only gave us part of the answer, because it's not just what your genes are that matters, it's how those genes are turned on or off. I was just on a panel with Craig and he said that 95% of all disease is genetic, and I would challenge that idea, because although we have certain fixed genetic code that determines our risk, how those genes are turned on or off is influenced by what we do to those genes every day, how the environment influences our genes in the biggest context. This concept of emergence, how does who we are, our phenotype, emerge from the dynamic interaction between our environment and our genes? How do we understand the exposome, which may be more important than the genome in chronic disease, which is our diet, our lifestyle, stresses, our microbiome, toxins, all these things which influence our gene expression. Or epigenetics. We now can not only understand the genes in their fixed form, but we can actually change those genes and how they are expressed by working with epigenetics. We need to understand that food is also a gene expression modifier. Nutrigenomics is an emerging field where we understand that food is not just calories, it's information, it's code, and you can literally upgrade or downgrade your biological software with every bite in real time. You can also change your microbiome with every bite in real time. And then we need to think about how our social interactions and connections drive our gene expression and our health. Very important. We'll talk about a little bit more. And these networks are really the future of understanding healthcare. And there's metabolic networks, there's gene networks, there's disease networks, there's organ networks, there's social networks. These are the things that Leroy Hood talked about that are really the things we need to understand in order to treat disease. There's another idea that came about for me, which was this idea that, we can't cure disease by just treating the disease. We need to understand the larger context in which disease occurs, the social, economic, and political conditions that drive disease. And I went to Haiti after the earthquake, and I met Paul Former. He's the other white guy in the picture. And and basically understood how he cured TB and AIDS, not by better drugs or surgery, but by understanding how the social drivers of disease were really more important to address, that people couldn't take their medicines on time because they didn't have a watch, they didn't have clean water. And he created a system of community health workers, what he called accompaniment. It's what Leroy Hood talked about, getting 70% adherence with health coaches for behavior change versus 10% compliance with normal approaches in medicine. So we have to understand not only what to do, but how do people change their behavior, not only how to change biology, and how to work with biological networks, but how to work with social networks to change behavior. So we now understand that diseases occur, and chronic diseases are really social diseases. They're not non-communicable diseases, that they arise in clusters based on the environment. For example, you're more likely to be overweight if your friends are overweight than if your parents are overweight, that the social threads that connect us are far more important than the genetic threads. That social networks are really driving so much of chronic illness today, and that we need to begin to understand not just social patterns, but also the biological patterns that underlie disease. Most of us don't really reflect as doctors on what are those biological patterns that are driving disease. And we began to hear about them when Larry Smarrs talking about his own experience with his health, and Leroy Hood talking about these biological networks and the patterns and the data. And I had to learn this myself in a very difficult way, which was after living in China, I got mercury poisoning. And I became very, very ill. I had total system breakdown. I had chronic fatigue syndrome, but my muscle enzymes went to 600. My autoimmune antibodies were elevated. My white count was down. My gut wasn't working. My brain stopped working. It was really a very devastating situation. And I had to really understand how to reverse engineer health by looking not at traditional disease models, but understanding how my system was breaking down, literally cell by cell, system by system. This was me 20 years ago, not looking that great. This is me today, 20 years later, feeling tremendously good, but it was based on understanding how to work with these disordered biological networks. And when I went to Haiti after the earthquake, the same thing. I began to understand how we need to not just deal with biological networks, but social networks as well. And that's when we met Paul Farmer. So we have to deal with this epidemic of chronic disease, and it's not going to be doing the same things better. A lot of what I hear today is applying amazing technologies, amazing insights, and amazing approaches, but they're often looking at using these approaches for fixing problems that are based on the old diagnostic model, which is the disease-based model. It's the ICD-10, which went from 12,000 diseases to now 155,000 diseases. The truth is that we have to understand the root causes and that are driving these epidemics, and it's not just the things that we typically think about. We need to understand, how do we create value in the healthcare system? It's creating better outcomes at lower costs. And yes, we need to improve efficiencies and better care coordination and reduce medical errors and improve technology. All these things are essential, but they're really not sufficient to deal with the real drivers, which is why people get sick in the first place. How do you work with these disordered biological networks? How do you create health? What is the science of creating health? That's what functional medicine is. It's applied systems biology that allows us to understand how to work with these biological networks in real time. So we need a different roadmap. We need a different GPS system to navigate this landscape. And we can't wait for big data and artificial intelligence to figure it out. We have to start somewhere. And we have to have a filter to analyze all the data we have so we make sense of it and can apply it clinically. And we've been doing this for a long time. And it's not by having all these silos. It's not by having all these different organs that we're looking at. It's looking at the systems of biology approach. And this is the model of functional medicine. It's been around for over 30 years. I'm the chairman of the Institute for Functional Medicine. I direct the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, which is the first functional medicine center in a major medical institution. And rather than looking at the organs and the organ systems, we look at the root causes. We look at the underlying roots and the trunk, as opposed to the just the diseases and the symptoms. We look at the underlying lifestyle factors, environmental factors, genetic factors, how these influence the biological networks. And this is the map we use. We call it the matrix. And we look at predisposing factors, including genetics, triggers. We look at fundamental lifestyle factors that are modifiable. And we look at how these affect these fundamental biological networks. And these are the things we find are the root of almost all disease: assimilation in the gut, defense and repair, immune system, energy and mitochondrial function and oxidative stress, detoxification and biotransformation, transport, which is our circulation, lymphatic circulation, communication, which is hormones, neurotransmitters, cytokines, and our structural integrity, all the way from our cellular structures all the way to our biomechanical structure. And these are all influenced by, we have too much of something or not enough of something, and the body creates disordered function in these biological networks. And these are the networks that we work with every day in functional medicine and create extraordinary outcomes that we're now studying at Cleveland Clinic through RCTs, through looking at biobanking and looking at patterns in the networks of the physiology, through extraordinary partnerships with some of the leading thinkers in Cleveland Clinic. This is now a little bit of a deep dive into what it is. So that's the very high level, but I want to share with you some cases. Now you can suspend your disbelief for a minute because what I'm going to share with you is pretty provoking because it challenges our conventional ideas. I would encourage you to keep your minds open, but as Groucho Marx says, not so open that your brains fall out. So this is Isabel, who came to me with mixed connective tissue disease. She was 10 years old. She had pretty much everything you could imagine. She had arthritis, myositis, she had rashes, Raynaud's, anemia, fatigue, and she ate a ton of sushi, and she had lots of antibiotics and lots of dairy, and was eating a diet full of sugar, which affects her gut microbiome. So rather than saying, how do I treat this girl by suppressing her inflammation, which is what the doctors did, how do I shut down the immune system? I said, why is her immune system so pissed off in the first place? I tried to figure out the cause. So she had elevated autoimmune antibodies that were off the chart. She had elevated muscle enzymes, liver function, SED rate. She was anemic, very, very many severe abnormalities in her lab work. So the doctors gave her symptom suppression treatment, IV Solumedrol every 3 weeks, 1,200 milligrams. That's a horse dose of Solumedrol. They gave her methotrexate, another immune suppressant, prednisone, another immune suppressant, an acid blocker because of how it was affecting her gut, nifedipine for Raynaud's, and aspirin for coagulopathy. And no one said, what is going on here? So we did some simple tests, which is antiglidin antibodies and genes for celiac. And she didn't have celiac, but she had gluten sensitivity. We looked at her stool, and she found like the lactoferrin that Larry had. We had high stool calprotectin, which wasn't inflammatory bowel disease, but it was on the spectrum of gut inflammation. And we did a provoked urine and found a very high level of mercury. So what we did was quite simple. We removed the triggers. We removed gluten and dairy and sugar. We gave her an antifungal and probiotics to help her gut flora restore. We gave her some nutritional support, and we helped her body detoxify from mercury. And 2 months later, her symptoms were gone. Her labs were better. A year later, her symptoms were completely gone, and all her labs were normal, including the CPK and autoantibodies, except for the RNP. And she was on no medication. This is her 2 months later, and this is her about a year later. I don't know if we can show the video here. You guys prompt the video? Yes.
I have mixed connective tissue disease. And my first treatment was I was on high doses of Solumedrol, methotrexate, and prednisone. My face swelled up like a grapefruit. Then I went to go see Dr. Hyman. He put me on a gluten-free, sugar-free, dairy-free diet and supplements. And now, a year and a half later, I can ride my horse, I can show I'm off of all those stupid medications, and I feel great.
So this, you could say this is an anecdote, but this is what we see over and over, day after day in our clinic at the Center for Functional Medicine, what I've been seeing for over 20 years, and our colleagues around the country and around the world have been doing for decades. It's been in the diaspora of medicine, it's on the margins and the edges, but now I think we can combine the resources of big data and artificial intelligence and some of the extraordinary things you've been hearing about to actually accelerate this model. This is another story of a little boy who had ADD, he had asthma, he had anal itching, he had abdominal cramps, he had anxiety, and that was just the A's, right? He had a whole list of problems, which is actually why I call myself a holistic doctor. And he was, again, having a lot of inflammatory issues that were affecting his brain. So rather than treating his ADD with medication, rather than treating all his diseases with medications, he was on 7 medications already. I said, what's the cause? What's going on here? And we worked with his gut. We cleaned up his diet. We gave him some basic nutritional support. And 2 months later, his mother brought him back. This was his homework. Before, at 12 years old, you couldn't read his writing. He had dysgraphia. 2 months later, this was his homework, without any occupational therapy. It just changed his brain function by changing his biology. I didn't treat his brain. I didn't treat the ADD. I didn't treat the asthma. I simply helped restore disordered function to normal function. So if the future of medicine is functional medicine, it's understanding how to work with these networks and systems medicine, both biological and social networks. This is from JAMA, one of my favorite articles. The concept of dementia, and you could substitute any disease, is obsolete. It combines categorical misclassification with etiologic imprecision, meaning we define disease by symptoms and not causes. So, for example, if you have someone coming in who's hopeless and helpless, has no interest in life, we say, oh, I know what's wrong with you. You're depressed. But depression is not a Prozac deficiency, right? He could have many causes. Just because you know the name of the disease doesn't mean you know what's wrong with you, right? We're really good at naming and blaming and taming. We name the disease. We go, I know what's wrong with you. You're depressed, and you need an antidepressant. And then we blame the name and we tame it with a drug. So it could be these eating gluten as Hashimoto's, which causes depression. It could be he's taken a PPI for 10 years and that causes B12 deficiency, or he lives in Seattle and has vitamin D deficiency, or because he eats taken antibiotics and has altered gut flora, or because he is eating sushi and has mercury poisoning, or hates fish and has omega-3 deficiency, or because he eats too many Cinnabons and has insulin resistance. All these will cause depression. It could be that not only does one disease have many causes, but one cause can create many diseases. Gluten and celiac can cause 55 different diseases. It can cause depression and autism and rheumatoid arthritis and osteoporosis and irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel, cancer, heart disease, and even dementia are all linked potentially to gluten. So we have to completely rethink the way we approach diagnosing disease and treating it. This is George, another holistic patient. He had angina, heart failure, diabetes, reflux. He had prostate issues, sexual dysfunction, you name it. He had it, 9 medications. Rather than treating his symptoms, I treated his system. We gave him real food, which is basically the most powerful drug on the planet that has the power to influence tens of thousands of genes, to actually optimize your microbiome, optimize your cytokines and immune networks, can balance dozens of hormones. It can do so with every single bite, faster and cheaper than any drug ever developed. It's a better drug than drugs. Food is not just like medicine, it is medicine. The question is, what should I eat? Right? Not the 6 to 11 servings of bread, rice, syrup, pasta that the government told us to eat, right? And fats and all sparingly. We gave him this, when you understand that food is information, not calories, it changes your conception of what to do. It's actually instructions, it's code, and you are changing what you're doing not just by the calories, but by the instructions in the food and the macronutrients and micronutrients. So just eat real food. We got him eating real food, fruits and vegetables, good fats. My last book was Eat Fat, Get Thin, so it's really about understanding the role of fats, good proteins, the right nutrients, and this is George before and after. He lost 155 pounds at 63 years old, reversed every single one of his diseases, heart failure, diabetes, angina, prostate issues, sinus issues, edema, you name it, he had it, and they're all gone. So at any age, we have the power to reverse our biology from disease states to optimal health states. Last case, dementia case. This is a woman who came to see me who we applied this map to. You heard Leroy Hood talk about Dale Bredesen and the MEN protocol and reversing early dementia. This is actually what this was based on. We did this, and I wrote a book called The Ultramind Solution, which is how the body affects the brain, about 7 or 8 years ago, which Dale read and got inspired and started applying this and seeing extraordinary results. And so this is a case of a woman who had early dementia. And she was on Crestor, which, by the way, may actually cause increase in amyloid in the brain. It's good for your heart, but bad for your brain. Her mother had dementia. She drank a lot of wine. She had inflammatory issues, right? She had ANA, rash on her face. Her hair was falling out. She was exposed to toxins, lots of dental fillings. You heard that. Leroy talked about someone who had high levels of mercury from dental amalgams, which, by the way, is something that most physicians and dentists completely discredit. And she had a lot of tuna consumption. So we did some testing, some of the same testing that's done in Aravel. The Pioneer 100 group used a lot of functional medicine diagnostics. It wasn't the metabolome and it wasn't the traditional microbiome analysis. It wasn't the genome. It was actually looking at some very real biomarkers that we use in functional medicine to assess disordered function. And we found she had low magnesium and low zinc and low CoQ10. Did you hear 91% of people are deficient in some nutrient in the Pioneer 100? And these are probably people who are fairly well nourished compared to the American population, who are educated, who are affluent, who eat well, and they're 91% of them are deficient in one or more nutrient. So we had evidence of mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress based on her tests. We looked at these nutritional imbalances she had, and rather than looking at the disease of dementia as a thing, we said, what is going on? Where's the disordered function, right? So we looked at nutritional imbalances, and she had methylation defects. She had hormonal imbalances. She had Hashimoto's that was undiagnosed with low T3. She had adrenal insufficiency, not Addison's, but just low cortisol. She had a lot of dental filling. She ate a lot of sushi. She had very, very high mercury levels of over 100 on a challenge testing. She had mold exposure. She had ApoE3/4, which actually predisposed her to Alzheimer's. And also, if you have the ApoE4 allele, you can't detoxify mercury as well. She had mitochondrial dysfunctions. We looked at energy imbalances, detox imbalances, nutrient imbalances, hormone imbalances, immune imbalances. This is the things we think about in real time with patients. This is actually how we apply this model. I'm not looking at disease. I'm saying, where is the disordered function? Where is the imbalance? And so basically, we found she had food sensitivities, inflammation, high CRP. We put her on a low glycemic diet, a very high-fat diet, whole foods, phytonutrient dense. Gave her a nutrient replacement, B12 shots, bioidentical thyroid, glutathione, detox support, got her rid of her fillings, got her off the fish. It was a long process of restoring these systems to optimal function. Not only did she lose weight, but she reported, and her family reported, she was 10 years younger physically and mentally and cognitively. She was brighter, energetic. Her CRP, her autoimmune markers normalized, her gut markers normalized, her mercury level came down after 2 years. And she did well for about 5 years. Her husband died. She regressed a little bit. We did a few little tweaks to her program, and she continues to be well functioning almost 10 years after her diagnosis, which is unheard of. Now, just the last little bit before we close. We've talked about how important it is to understand biological networks and how to work with those real-time in clinical medicine. And yes, we need help from big data and from AI and from understanding how to look at these patterns that Leroy is talking about. We're seeing these in functional medicine, but we don't have the research support yet. We don't have the big data support that we need to actually make this really come to life. And this is why we're starting to do this at Cleveland Clinic. And if anybody wants to partner with us, please come talk to me. I'm doing a workshop at 1:45. So Paul Farmer, really showed that this model was possible in a very powerful way. And I realized when I came back from Haiti that chronic disease was a social disease, and we need a social cure. It's not only good enough to change biology, you have to change behavior, because a lot of these things are behavior-driven. So I call this sociogenomics. And one day I'm in my office, this guy, Rick Warren, shows up, and he's basically very overweight, and he runs this big church in Southern California. And I said, Rick, why don't we go to dinner afterwards? Tell me about your church. I'm a Jewish doctor from New York. I don't know much about your church. He said, well, we've got 30,000 people. He said, yeah, we get 5,000 small groups that meet every week to help each other live better lives. I'm like, wow, we need to work with you, because this is not just a mega church, there's thousands of mini churches. And why don't we put a program in your church? It's a great idea, because last week I was baptizing my church, and after about the 800th person, I'm like, man, we're a fat church. And I'm fat, and we need to fix this. So we launched this. We thought a couple hundred people would show up. 15,000 people showed up and signed up the first week. They lost 250,000 pounds in the first year. Not only that, but all these diseases went away that were treated based on using the principles of functional medicine applied in groups at scale, without a health coach, without a nutritionist, without a doctor, using the peer support model to help transform behavior. And this was Daniel. He was 340 pounds, rheumatoid arthritis, 15 medications. Rebecca, also very overweight, tried yo-yo diets. He lost 110 pounds. In 40 days, he got off all his medications, and Rebecca lost 58 pounds. This is them. This is a powerful, powerful model. We wrote a book called The Daniel Plan. I wanted to call it The Jewish Doctor's Guide to Christian Wellness, but it didn't go so well. And we ended up winning the Christian Book of the Year award. I'm the only Jewish guy to ever win that award. But well, there was that one guy 2,000 years ago, but I call this the love diet, and here's the punchline. We need to not only change the way we do medicine, which is how we deliver care, understanding the social drivers of disease, but we need to change the medicine we do, the actual content of care, not just treating the same diagnostic categories of disease, but really rethink disease, rethink health, rethink medicine. Thank you very much.